Welcome to week 13 of our Journey Through the Bible series. Tonight we're going to be talking about the book of Esther and the book of Job. We're going to start with the book of Esther, and it was approximately written 470 BC. The author is unknown, but it was thought possibly that Mordecai wrote it. Some have even suggested Ezra and Nehemiah because of the similarity of their writing styles. The story is set in the Persian Empire, and most of it takes place in the king's palace, which was in the Parisian capital. The book begins with Queen Vashti, cannot pronounce these words that well, refusing to obey an order from her husband, who was the king, Xerxes. So the king was having a party. He was having a get together, and he had all these people there. And someone mentions, "Hey, bring the queen out. And let's see her because she was beautiful, and people wanted to see her." So he sends servants to go tell her to come down. She says no, in front of everybody. She says, "No, I'm not coming." So she refused to obey his order. So he puts her out. He banishes her, and he starts to search for a new queen. So the way that they searched for a new queen was they got all of the virgins, not all of them. They went and picked out the most beautiful virgins in the area and brought them in. They brought them into the kingdom, the palace, and they put them through beautification and all of those types of things. Esther was one of the people that was brought in, one of the virgins that was brought in to be looked at as a possibility to be the new queen. She found favor in the eyes of the ones who were doing the beautification processes and who were bringing them before the king. The king would spend some time with each one to see which one he chose. And she found favor, and she becomes the new queen. So the story begins 103 years after Nebuchadnezzar had taken the Jews into captivity. There had been groups of exiles that had been allowed to return to Jerusalem, but Esther's parents must have been among those exiles that did not want to return, because not all of them went back to Jerusalem. Some of them stayed in the Parisian Empire, and they had lives there. They didn't want to uproot that, or for whatever reason, they didn't go back. So her family did not go back. The key people in the book are Esther, her uncle Mordecai, who helped raise her, the king, and Haman. Haman is a worker of the king's, and he hates Mordecai. And because of that, he ends up turning against the Jewish people. And he wants the king to issue a decree to kill all of the Jewish people. And we see how God uses and placed Esther in the kingdom for that specific time to be used of God to help the Jewish people survive. So the key verse is chapter 4, verse 14. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to a royal position for such a time as this. Queen Esther was placed there for a very specific purpose at a very specific time. And I think just like her, none of us are born by coincidence or haphazardly. We are born with a very specific gifting and very specific callings and plans in our lives that God has placed in there for a specific time. And many times I think we can easily forget that we have calling and that we have purpose and we have giftings. We can get so wrapped up in the pain that we're suffering or situations we've been through or our past or whatever it is that we forget or we get sidelined. And I just want to encourage you, even if your calling has been buried in the backyard for 20 years, get the shovel out, unearth that thing, and bring it out. And maybe you don't know what your calling is. Maybe you've never understood your calling or your purpose. Ask God, because He will tell you. He will tell you what plans He has for you. And I promise you, if you have breath and your heart is beating, you have purpose and God has plans for your life. Don't let the enemy lie to you. Don't let anybody steal it from you. Seek out your purpose and your calling and get back in the game and get back to doing what God has called you to do. Here's the chapter outline. Verses 1 and 2 is where there's a search for a new queen. Chapter 3 is Haman's plot, where he is plotting against Mordecai, which in turn is plotting against all of the children of Israel, all the Jewish people, because he wants Mordecai to die. Chapters 4 through 6, we see Esther's plan. So Esther decides to have all of the Jewish people fast for her so that she can go into the king and she will go into the king and ask him to save her people. But here's the thing, one queen had already been banished for disobedience. For her to go in and talk to the king without being summoned by him was strictly forbidden. It was disobedience. And she knew that she was risking her life. She was risking everything to go in there without him summoning her. So she had the people praying and fasting, and she prayed and fasted. In chapter 7, we see Haman's downfall. He tried to come against the Jewish people, but it got turned all the way around on him. In chapters 8 through 10, we see how God used Esther to save the whole entire Jewish race. So, the importance of reading Esther. What we read is that Esther was an ordinary girl who saved a generation through her bravery. She was an orphan and probably never dreamed of being a queen. God used her, and we can learn through this story that God can use anyone for his plan. We just need to submit to his will and go where he calls us. We need to fight back our fear and let God use us, no matter how great or how small the calling is. We need to just allow God to do what he wants to do through our life. In chapter 3, we reread that Mordecai refused to kneel down before Haman. And that's what really set Haman off. He was a descendant of Agag. Haman was king of the Amalekites. The Amalekites were ancient enemies of Israel, and Mordecai would not bow to him. What we can learn for us today is that when people demand things from us that does not honor God, we should not give in. We have to take a stand for what's right before God. God is our authority, and we have to look to him for our final rule and authority. His law trumps every other law. His rulings, his decrees, his word trumps everything else. And we always have to look to his word for the final authority. We see that Esther risked her life by coming before the king. No one, not even the queen, was allowed to approach the king. Not even the queen was allowed to approach the queen. Sorry. No one, not even the queen, was allowed to approach the king without being asked. But after prayer and fasting for 3 days, she knew that God would protect her and that she was doing what was his will. She realized her strength would come from God and God alone. It was not relying upon her. And through this, we can learn that we need to rely on God's wisdom, his protection, and his strength. We need to not look to our own ability, but look to God's ability and look to what he can do in his power. Because if we get stuck on ourselves, we'll never do anything. Because we know we're not capable. We know we don't have the power, and we know our limitations, but God is limitless. What he can do in and through a submitted life is just amazing. That's where we need to be. We read that Esther found out about Haman's plan to kill the Jews, and when it happened, she didn't jump up and run to the king immediately. She didn't get in her emotions. She didn't get in her own plan. She didn't run ahead. Instead, she prayed and she fasted, and she waited on God to tell her when to approach the king and how to do it. While all the people were fasting and praying, God was keeping the king up at night and led him to read the book of the kingdom. If Esther had immediately went into the king, he wouldn't have read that book yet. And that book reminded him of Mordecai's good deeds for saving his life, the good deed of saving his life. So what we can learn is God's timing is perfect. There may be things he is doing that we're unaware of, so it's important to wait on him. There's so many things that we see that we want done or we want to do. I remember there was a time that there was just things that was laid on my heart or that I seen, and there was a great need. One was a group. And so I started this group on Facebook. And then I quickly realized, wow, I hadn't even waited on God. And I got overwhelmed, and it was just too much. And I'd taken on too much because I hadn't waited for God's timing. There was another time that I really felt a burden for people reading the Bible. And so I thought, well, maybe I should start a group and we could all read through the Bible together. But then I felt a check in my spirit, and I'm like, I just need to wait. And a couple days later, a good friend of mine said, I feel like, or I didn't say, I seen on Facebook where they had started a group to read through the Bible together. And the Holy Spirit spoke to me and said, everything is a calling, but not everything is my calling. And so many times, we just want to jump and do our own thing, and we see a need and we just want to jump in, or, we want to do what we want to do. And we can do the wrong thing, and we can be out of God's timing, even if it's something he's called us to. When I was 18 years old, I got saved, and he started talking to me about that he was going to use me to heal people emotionally, physically, mentally, all of it. And that he showed me some other things. And I held on to that through all of these years, and I did not start seeing any of that come to pass. until I was in my early 40s. And I easily could have, and there probably were times that I got in the way, and that I tried to create my own thing, or I tried to do my own thing, and God just shut it down because it wasn't his plan. There were a lot of pieces that had to be put together. So even when God tells us to do something, we need to wait on his timing. We read that Mordecai was a wonderful mentor and father figure to Esther. He gave her good and timely advice. What we can learn from this is that we all need God loving mentors in our life. We need people who will advise us and correct us and even rebuke us when we need it. We also read that God is in control of everything that happened in the book of Esther, yet Mordecai and Esther had to act. Esther saved a nation. God used her to save the entire nation. Her obedience saved God's people from destruction. So, what we can learn is that God chooses to work through those who are willing to act from him. We should pray as if it all depends on God and act as if it depends on us. Faith without works is dead. There's times that we have to get up and we have to do and we have to move and we have to work and we have to put time in to do the things of God, the things that he wants us to do. I think about spiritual warfare. I come into contact with so many people who say, well, I just want God to take care of it. I just want God to do it. And when I hear that, I'm often reminded of the story about David and Goliath. David faced down a giant. He stood face to face, toe to toe, eye to eye with a huge, massive giant. And God could have struck Goliath dead with lightning, but he didn't. He equipped David for the battle. He taught him. He gave him power. He gave him aim. He gave him the ability to fight the giant. But David had to pick up the slingshot, and he had to pick out the stones, and he had to pull back the slingshot and let it go and take aim. It took action. It took faith and it took action. And so many times in life, we are required of the same thing. But I think we get sidelined because we're just sitting there saying, God, you do it. God, you fix it. God, you move it. God, instead of saying, God, I submit to you. Whatever part you want me to play in this, I will play in it. Whatever you want me to do, I will do. Wherever you want my feet pointed, my feet will be pointed. And so we have to be careful that we don't get stuck just sitting back and waiting for something to happen when God is sitting and waiting for us to act and move. In chapter 7, we see that Haman's hatred and evil plotting turned against him when the king discovered his true intentions. He was hanged on the gallows that he had built for Mordecai. In Proverbs 26:27, we learn that a person who digs a pit for others will fall into it himself. We seen in that story exactly reaping and sowing. Haman reaped hatred and murder and vengeance because that's what he was trying to sow into Mordecai's life. And the plan and plots that he had against Mordecai, God revealed, and he suffered the consequences. So some things you can learn and think about whenever you're reading the book of Esther. 1, what can you learn from the lives of each of the main characters? Have you ever thought you have to come to the kingdom for such a time as this? That you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Has that ever went through your mind? What is God calling you to do in this very moment? Consider why Mordecai was unwilling to bow before Haman. Have you ever bowed to someone or something, and in do so, you compromised your calling position as a child of God? Have you ever done something to just fit in or to not stand out? Have you given in? Have you compromised? One compromise here, one compromise there, just so that you're not different or for whatever reason. Esther and Mordecai relied heavily on prayer and fasting to turn things around. Do you use prayer and fasting in your life? Is that something that is personal to you? Is it something that you do? If not, we as Christians all need to be praying and fasting. It is biblical. There's many, many, many biblical examples of prayer and fasting. Okay, now we're going to talk about the book of Job. The date written is unknown, but it's guessed to be approximately 2000 to 1800 BC. Many think that this is the oldest book of the Bible. Not that it necessarily happened the oldest. Of course, it didn't happen before Genesis, but that it was recorded earlier than any other book. Some scholars think that. The author is unknown, but some think it to be Job. Some have also suggested Moses or Solomon. This book took place in the land of Uz, probably located northeast of Palestine near the desert land between Damascus and the Euphrates River. It's believed that Job probably lived during the days of the patriarchs like Adam. I'm sorry, not Adam. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, before God gave his written law or appointed priests to be religious leaders. During this time, the father was the family's religious leader. The purpose of the book is to show God's sovereignty and the meaning of true faith. This book gives us one of the reasons to the question, why do the righteous suffer? It's one of the questions I hear the most. Why do good people go through bad things? The key verse is chapter 2, verse 3. Then the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? There was no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil, and he still maintains his integrity, though you incite me against him to ruin him without any reason. And then 19, verses 25 through 26. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand upon the earth. After my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. The chapter outline is chapters 1 through 2. We see Job is tested with horrific test. He loses everything. His health, his children, his livestock. He loses everything. His friends turn against him. His wife turns against him. He loses everything but his life. In chapters 3 through 31, we see 3 friends answer Job, and they are no help at all. Chapters 32 through 37 is one of the speeches of his friends. Then in chapters 38 through 41, we see God answering Job. God actually answers him, talks to him. And in chapter 42, we see Job is restored. So some things that we can learn as we are reading through the book of Job. 1, Job was a wealthy man who loves God, yet God allowed Satan to destroy his flocks, his possessions, his children, and his health. Even though Job did not understand what was happening to him, he had no idea why it was happening, he still chose to trust God. So what we can learn, God didn't explain to Job what was happening. And there will be times that we go through things that we just don't understand why we're going through them. That is when we will be faced with what we really believe. Do we really believe that God is faithful and that we can trust him? If we really know him, know his character, we will know that he is trustworthy because we will know him intimately. We will know his word. We know his character based on his word. If we know him, his character, I already read that. Faith shouldn't be built on rewards or prosperity. That is a very shallow faith. So we can't base our faith on, well, God gave me that or God gives me this. Faith is based on knowing God's character and who he is. It must be built on the confidence that God's ultimate purpose will come to pass and that his ways are higher than our ways. And we may never understand some of the things he does. We're not called to understand him. We are called to not lean on our own understanding, but to acknowledge God in all of our ways. In chapter 1, we see that Satan tells God that the only reason Job fears him is because God has blessed him in his life and everything in it was so good. He had no reason to turn against God. Satan wanted to prove that Job didn't worship God because he loved him, but only because God had given him so much. So what we can learn from this is Satan goes to God and he accuses believers like you and me as an attempt to discredit us before God. If he accuses us of not being a true worshiper, of not being faithful, even during trials and tribulations in this life, would he be right? Whew. That one stops me in my tracks. Does it you? What could Satan accuse us of? And would he be right in it? Or would God say that we're blameless in his sight? Or would what the devil's saying, would it be accurate? When storms come and heartache and suffering, we have to put the roots of our faith even deeper in God so that we can withstand it. We have to spend even more time in his presence, in prayer, and in the word. We also read that all 3 of Job's friends made the mistake of assuming that Job had committed some great sin that had caused his suffering. What we can learn is not all suffering is because of sin or because of our own fault. So we can never assume that about people. Sometimes God is disciplining us. Sometimes we suffer because of our own foolish mistakes and decisions. But sometimes we can be doing everything right and we're just going through a test. We have to make sure we learn every lesson God is trying to teach us during that time by asking him, God, what do you want me to learn? What am I not getting? What do you want me to know? We see Job's friends and his wives didn't encourage Job. His wife tried to get him to curse God and die. Satan will use those closest to us to discourage us, try to make us feel that God doesn't love us and that he doesn't care about us. We have to refuse to believe those lies. We have to know God and his character for ourselves and recognize those lies. Also, we can learn what kind of friend not to be. We are to encourage one another and not bring each other down further. In chapter 13, Job compared his three friends to doctors who didn't know what they were doing. They were like eye surgeons trying to perform open heart surgery. Many of the ideas about God were true, but they didn't apply to Job's situation. They assumed they knew what they was talking about, and they didn't. They were right to say that God is just. They were right to say that God punishes sin, but they were wrong to assume that Job's suffering was a just punishment for his sin. They took a true principle and applied it wrongly. They twisted it and they changed it. So that shows us we have to be careful in how we apply biblical principles to others and ourselves. We must be slow to judge and pray for discernment so that we know that we're speaking truth and not twisting the word of God. In chapters 38 through 41, instead of answering Job's questions directly, God asked Job a series of questions that no human could possibly answer. Job responds by recognizing that God's ways are best. So we can learn that it's foolish for us to think we can stand up against God. We won't know the reasons for everything that happens, but we have to ask ourselves, will I trust God with my unanswered questions? Or am I using what I don't understand as an excuse for a lack of trust? That was me for many years. I could never understand why I had went through the abuse and suffered the abuse that I did. And it always stood between God and me. It was always the wall that, well, if God didn't keep me safe, will he keep me safe now? Can I trust him? Is he trustworthy? Because I was always trying to figure out the why. I was holding so tight. I had a death grip on why did that happen? Why did I have to go through that? Why do people have to suffer? And I remember when I started walking through the process of deliverance, one of the things that he brought to me was almost like a vision. Well, maybe it was. I can't remember exactly. It's been a few years now. But it was like I was standing at a crossroads and I knew I could continue on my life the way it was, exactly the same. Or I could let go of the need to understand the why and walk in freedom. Now, that wasn't the whole thing, but that was part of it. It was part of the process of freedom. And at that moment, I surrendered the need to know why people go through things, why I have went through things, what the purpose was. I just released all of that. And God had given me this scripture: trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding, in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. Years prior. But for years I had been leaning on my own understanding, wanting to know why. When I released that, it brought healing that I can't even explain. And from that moment forward, I've not picked it back up again. Could I? Yeah. But I'm not going to, because I don't need to understand. I don't have to understand. The Bible tells me to not lean on my own understanding, but to acknowledge God in all my ways, and he will make my path straight. I don't know why bad things happen. You know, we can say we live in a fallen world. It's full of free will. It's full of the devil, those types of things. Yes, we know that. But I don't have to analyze it. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to figure it out. I don't have to have an answer for people when they ask me. It's not on me to figure any of those things out and have any of those answers. My job is to have faith in God and say, God, I'm looking at you now through the lens of your word and not the lens of my situation, because I spent years looking at him through the lens of my situation. I removed that and I started looking at my situation through the lens of God's word and his character and who he is. And I started looking at God through the lens of his word, who his word says he is. And that's what we're called to do. There's some things we just have to let go of. And it's a choice. It's not necessarily a feeling at all. It's choosing to say, I'm releasing that. I'm surrendering that. I don't have to figure that out. I don't need to know that, and just really letting it go. So some things to think about as you read Job. What did you learn about Satan and his relationship to God and to Job? One, we learned that he goes and talks to God, which I find that fascinating. He goes and accuses us. How many times, I wonder, do we pick up on those accusations when we have self-hatred? What do we learn about Job? What does God say about him? What does Satan say about him? How does he respond to God, his pain, his friends, and the counsel of his wife? In chapter 42, verse 7, God says that Job's friends didn't speak what was right concerning him. Keep a list of what was said wrong in respect to God and Job's suffering. Think about that so that whenever you are in the same type of situation to offer support to somebody, you don't fall into the same trap of doing what his friends did. Think about Job's end compared to his beginning, and then ask yourself, if Job's suffering was worth it, what about your suffering? What can it produce if you respond the proper way? What is the proper way? What did you learn from Job and how he responded to his suffering? What have you learned about Satan and his relationship to God? How can these insights comfort you? As you read chapter 31, pay attention to every if and every if I have. Think about how Job appealed to his own integrity in these various matters of life. How does your own integrity measure up to those areas? What do you need to remember? What do you need to do? What do you need to hold on to? What do you need to let go of? What do you need to begin? Or what do you need to stop? I hope this has been helpful. Please feel free to message me or comment on any of the platforms you're watching this on. And you all have a good evening. Be blessed.